Hi, welcome back to Truth Fairy Tidbits. I am the Truth Fairy. I am here to feed you little tidbits of information that if you are still a statist and believe in government and voting and things of that sort, these are sources of information that you probably would not look at if somebody just handed it to you and said, hey, deprogram your dumbass. So I'm here to spoon feed you bite-sized pieces in hopes that one of these little nuggets of information will crack your head open and you'll be able to think again. That's the goal. So if you have not been here before, please go back, start at the beginning of my videos, and it'll make a lot more sense. Okay, jumping back into the next book that we are on, The Most Dangerous Superstition by Larkin Rose. And this next section is called Identifying the Enemy. What is going on? Lord. Okay. And here we go. From early childhood, we are taught to submit to the will of authority, to obey the edicts of those who in one way or another have acquired positions of power and control. From the beginning, the goodness of a child is graded, whether explicitly or implicitly, first by how well they obey the parents, then by how well they obey teachers, and then how well they obey the laws of government. Whether implied or stated, society is saturated with the message that obedience is a virtue and that good people are the ones who do what authority tells them to do. As a result of that message, the concepts of morality and obedience have become so muddled in most people's minds that they attack any attack on the notion of authority will to most people feel like an attack on morality itself. Any suggestion that government is inherently illegitimate will sound like suggesting that everyone should behave as uncaring, vicious animals living by the code of survival of the fittest. Uh-oh. I didn't know my dog was in here under the covers. Let's see how this goes. The trouble is that the average person's belief system rests upon a hodgepodge of vague and often contradictory concepts and assumptions. Terms such as morality, crime, law, and legislation, leaders and citizens are often used by people who have never rationally examined the concepts. To understand the nature of authority and government, we must begin by precisely defining what those terms mean. I gotta let my dog out. Hang on one sec. Here. Get out. Sorry. Where was I? What is this big thing we call government? It is an organization that tells people what to do, but that alone does not provide a complete definition because all sorts of other individuals and organizations that we do not call government also tell people what to do. Government, however, does not simply suggest or request, it commands. Then again, advertisers and preachers could also be said to give commands, but they are not considered government. Unlike the commands of preachers and advertisers, the commands of government are backed by the threat of punishment and the use of force against those who do not comply. But even then, that does not give us a complete definition because street thugs and bullies also enforce their commands, but no one refers to them as government. The distinguishing feature of government is that it is thought to have the moral right to give and enforce commands. Its commands are called laws, and disobeying its commands is called crime. In short, the defining factor which makes something government is the perceived legitimacy and righteousness of the power and control it exerts over others. In other words, its authority. Authority can be summed up as the right to rule. It is not merely the ability to forcibly control others, which to some extent nearly everyone possesses. It is the supposed moral right to forcibly control others. What distinguishes a street gang from government is how they are perceived by the people they control. The trespassers, robbery, extortion, assault, and murder committed by common thugs are perceived by almost everyone as being immoral, unjustified, and criminal. Their victims may comply with their commands, but not out of any feeling of moral obligation to obey, but merely out of fear. It's a day, I guess. We're having one of these days. I can get through it, I promise. Hang in there. If the intended victims of the street gang thought they could resist without any danger to themselves, they would do so. without the slightest feeling of guilt. They do not perceive the street thug to be any sort of legitimate, rightful ruler. They do not imagine him to be authority. The loot the thug collects is not referred to as taxes, and his threats are not called laws. The commands issued by those who wear the label of government, on the other hand, are perceived very differently by most of those at whom the commands are aimed. Most people perceive the power and control which the lawmakers in government extort over everyone else to be valid and legitimate, legal and good. Most who comply with such commands by obeying the law and who surrender their money by paying taxes do not do so merely out of fear of punishment if they disobey, but also out of a feeling of duty to obey. No one takes pride in being robbed by a street gang, but many wear the label of law-abiding taxpayer as a badge of honor. This is due entirely to how the obedient perceive the ones giving the commands. If the controllers are perceived as authority, then by definition they are seen as having the moral right to give such commands, which in turn implies a moral obligation on the part of the people to obey those commands. To label oneself a law-abiding taxpayer is to brag about one's loyalty to loyal obedience to government. In the past, some churches have claimed the right to punish heretics and other sinners, but in the Western world today, the concept of authority is almost always linked to government. In fact, in this day and age, the term implies the other. Authority supposedly derives from the decrees of laws of government, and government is the organization imagined to have the right to rule, i.e., authority. It is essential to differentiate between a command being justified upon the situation and being justified upon who gave the command. Only the latter is the type of authority being addressed in this book, though the term is occasionally used in other sense, which tends to muddle the distinction. For example, when someone asserts that he had the authority to stop a mugger to get an old lady's purse back, or says that he had the authority to chase trespassers off of his property, he's not claiming to possess any special rights that others do not possess. He is simply saying that he believes that the certain situations justify giving orders or using force. In contrast, the concept of government is about certain people having some special rights to rule. And that idea, the notion that some people, as a result of elections or other political rituals, for example, have the moral right to control others, in situations where most people would not, is the concept being addressed here. Only those in government are thought to have the right to enact laws. Only they are thought to have the right to impose taxes. Only they are thought to have the right to wage wars, to regulate certain matters, to grant licenses for various activities, and so on. When the belief in authority is discussed in this book, that is the meaning being referred to, the idea that some people have the moral right to forcibly control others, and that consequently, those others have the moral obligation to obey. It should be stressed that authority is always in the eye of the beholder. If the one being controlled believes that the one controlling him has the right to do so, then the one being controlled sees the controller as authority. If the one being controlled does not perceive the control to be legitimate, then the controller is not viewed as authority, but as simply being a bully or a thug. The tentacles of the belief in authority reach into every aspect of human life, but the common denominator is always the perceived legitimacy of the control it exerts over others. Every law and tax, federal, state, and local, every election and campaign, every license and permit, every political debate and movement, in short, everything having to do with government, from a trivial town ordinance to a world war, rests entirely upon the idea that some people have acquired the moral right in one way or another to rule over others. The issue here is not just the misuse of authority or an argument about good government versus bad government, but an examination of the fundamental underlying concept of authority. Whether an authority is seen as an absolute or having conditions or limits upon it may have a bearing on how much damage that authority does, but it has no bearing on whether the underlying concept is rational. The U.S. Constitution, for example, which we just covered extensively in the last book, is imagined to have created an authority which, at least in theory, had a severely restricted right to rule. Nonetheless, it still sought to create an authority with the right to do things like tax and regulate, which the average citizen has no right to do on his own. Though it pretended to give the right to rule over to certain specific matters, it still claimed to bestow some authority upon a ruling class, and as such, is just as much a target of the following criticism of authority as the authority of a supreme dictator would be. Okay, then he's just going to clarify this last paragraph about some other types of authority that we're not talking about. The term authority is sometimes used in ways that have nothing to do with the topic of this book. For example, one who's an expert in some field is often referred to as an authority. Likewise, some relationships resemble authority but do not involve any right to rule. The employer-employee relationship is often viewed as there is a boss and an underling. However, no matter how domineering or overbearing an employer may be, he cannot conscript workers or imprison them for disobedience. The only power he really has is the power to terminate the arrangement by firing the employee. And the employee has the same power because he can quit. And the same is true for other relationships that may resemble authority, such as a craftsman and his apprentice, or martial arts sensei and his pupil, or a trainer and the athlete he trains. Such scenarios involve arrangement based on mutual voluntary agreement in which either side is free to opt out of the arrangement. Such a relationship where one person voluntarily allows voluntarily allows another to direct his actions in hopes that he will benefit from the other's knowledge or skill. This is not the type of authority that is the subject of this book. Okay, that was a lot. So the point being, again, we covered voluntary consent extensively in the last book, but he's making that point again. Any other of these relationships that he can claim to be authority, you enter into a relationship with that person of authority, and either one of you are free to leave that relationship of perceived authority. That's not what we have with government. As Lysander Spooner says, government that claims to rest on consent, you have to be able to contract with that government voluntarily, consensually, on your own, individually, and you have to be able to leave that situation and not be stuck under that contract of consent that the Constitution pretends to give. The other point here about, he's going to get into a lot more, but having the right to rule, that's what perceived authority is. It claims that it has a moral right to dominate and rule over others. And we're all brainwashed from day one to believe that you are morally obligated to obey this right, okay? But where does that right come from? I made this example before. If it is wrong for me to go to your house, beat you up and steal your stuff, in what way and how does that become a right because a group of thugs do it that we call government? So if you understand, you cannot delegate a right that you don't already have. If it's wrong for me to do it, it is wrong for anybody else to do it or any group of people to do it. In no way, just because a conglomerate comes together, calls himself government, create somehow a right out of things that were wrong, okay? That's the most basic way to explain it. If I don't have the right to do something, you don't have the right to do something. It can't become a right because a group of other people get together and do it. Okay, does that make any sense? I hope so. He'll explain it a lot better. I'm not great at it. So that's all for today. That was a little bit of a long section. It's getting, it's difficult to skim through this book like I did with the last book. I highlighted and cut the key points. But so far, pretty much everything he says is kind of a key point. So I'll do my best to try and not read every single word, because that would probably take us a couple of months to get through this book. But again, I might, because guess what? I don't have anything else to do. So we'll leave it there for today. Got a little bit long. I'm sorry. My dog got in the way. I couldn't talk. I don't know what's going on. It's Tuesday, I guess. All right, then. I'll see you on another time. Do not comply. Bye.